Gothic architecture, at its core, was an evolution of Romanesque architecture, drawing additional inspiration from Muslim architectural styles, and it expanded upon these styles to create churches and cathedrals of unprecedented size and complexity. In its early days, the style was known as the French style, which denotes its country of origin. The popularity of Gothic architecture began in the early 12th century, with the first clear example of the style being the Basilica of Saint Denis, completed in 1144 near Paris. The basilica incorporated all of the major elements of the Gothic style, as did the Notre Dame of Paris, which was completed soon after in 1160. These rather monumental initial displays of the Gothic style set the tone for what was to come, over 400 years of cathedrals that reached from the heavens with massive windows, arcs, and buttresses. Though the early period of Gothic architecture is generally thought to have begun in the early 12th century, the cause of the shift in style began to take place over a century earlier. It was the relative, and relative must be stressed, period of little conflict that took place from 1000 and onward in Western Europe that allowed the prosperity of the regions where the Gothic style would eventually come from to grow, such that new churches and cathedrals could be built in new and interesting styles. Again, to be clear, it was a relative peace. As you've probably noted, that William the Conqueror's invasion of England did take place during this time, a conflict that involved two of the major countries that would eventually take to Gothic architecture. Structurally, the foundation of Gothic architecture lay in the pointed arc. A variation on the Romanesque rounded arc, the pointed arc had, as one would expect, a point. The importance that this relatively tame change in form held was that it, by distributing the weight it held in a more favorable way, allowed the arc to support nearly triple the weight of its Roman predecessor. This, in turn, made it much easier for buildings of the Gothic style to reach their towering heights, while still leaving plenty of room for massive glass windows along the walls. This also allowed the columns and walls that supported the arc to be made thinner, such that the large cathedrals, though still requiring a massive amount of material, could save some of those materials when constructing the walls and columns. The idea of the pointed arc came from Muslim architects, who had used it for centuries before Western Europe adopted it. The first known pointed arcs in Islamic buildings were constructed near modern-day Iraq in the late 8th century, and it's believed that the Gothic architects of France got the idea from the Spanish Muslims a couple of centuries later. The pointed arc was then used in the Gothic style as the base for more complicated structures, such as the ribbed vault or flying buttress. The flying buttress utilized several pointed arcs, half arcs, and beams to distribute the weight of the massive cathedral ceilings downward, keeping the structure stable. Coupled with ribbed vaults, intersecting pointed arcs, which strengthened the interior of the cathedral and held up portions of the lower ceilings, these innovations gave Gothic cathedrals their signature exteriors and interiors. These structural cornerstones of Gothic architecture were the focus of the early Gothic period, which ranged from approximately 1120 to 1200. The early Gothic period chiefly took place in the Île-de-France, the region of France which encompasses Paris. Due in large part to the general wealth of the region, the Gothic style was able to first fully develop there, simply because they had the resources to do so. Not only was there a general wealth, but a relative period of peace that allowed for the development of these architecture advancements. It was also during this time that the general model for the levels of Gothic cathedrals was developed. The 4 levels, ground level, tribune gallery, triforium, and clerestory, Each served a different purpose. The ground level contained the nave and choir of the cathedral, which had their ceilings supported by rib vaults. The nave was a large area where the congregation would gather, with the choir being a smaller, slightly elevated area where, fittingly, the choir would stand during a service. Behind the choir was the apse, a semicircular area typically at the eastern end of the cathedral. The tribune gallery was above the ground level and was essentially a sort of balcony that overlooked the area below. It was the width of the aisle that was below it. The aisle was a walking area that was on either side of the ground level and allowed churchgoers to move about the room without disrupting anything going on in the nave or choir. Above the tribune gallery was the triforium, which originated in Romanesque architecture and was diminished in Gothic architecture to be a smaller gallery. Some cathedrals had both, some had just a tribune gallery, and some just a triforium. Toward the ceiling of the cathedral was the final level, the clerestory. There wasn't an aisle or balcony at this level, and it was mostly populated by the stained glass windows that Gothic architecture is so well known for. Dedicating a whole level to the windows allowed said windows to be quite massive in size, which was one of the main goals in the design of Gothic cathedrals. In fact, as the Gothic period progressed, architects continued to look for and implement methods to further enlarge the windows by reducing the space needed for structural support, such that more biblical scenes could be depicted on them. It is important to keep in mind that the vast majority of Gothic cathedrals were built before the lower or middle classes had much of a chance at learning how to read. Therefore, the only ways they got to experience the teachings of the Bible were through someone, such as a priest, reading it to them at Mass, or through visual methods of communication. It was in the church's best interest, then, to make their windows depicting scenes of the Bible as large, detailed, and beautiful as possible, such that all of the clergy could see some of the more impressive scenes in the Bible for themselves. In the largest cathedrals, it would be a bit difficult to see much of what was on the windows from so far down, given the detail, but the general splendor of the windows would still be clear to those that saw them.
Following these foundational and often characteristic early developments in the Gothic style came the High Gothic period, which encompassed most of the 13th century. It was during this period that nuance and decoration came to hold more importance in the design of Gothic buildings, such that the developments made during the period would come to be known as radiant, or decorative Gothic architecture. Key features of the period include the circular rose window, pinnacles, window tracery, and just general aesthetic improvements. The structural basis for the style had been established, and the subsequent years would find little change on that front. The circular rose window is another widely recognized feature of Gothic cathedrals, and the initial idea of it comes from the Roman oculus, a much smaller, much less decorative window. The rose window was typically on the west end, or the front, of the cathedral, where the clergy would enter into the nave from. It was the tracery that made it possible to create the large rose windows, as well as enlarge the rest of the glass ones up in the clerestory. Tracery was decorative, stonework that was added to windows. And along with adding to the general aesthetic quality of windows, it also provided extra structural support. Pinnacles are ornamentation that top buttresses and towers, and were spaced along parapets in the tops of turrets. They were vertical spires and range widely in size, height, and degree of ornamentation. The main goal of pinnacles was to create some variety in otherwise unappealing or bland structural elements of Gothic buildings, explaining why they are so often seen topping buttresses. Molding was utilized for similar reasons, but it was a decorative series of carvings and reliefs along the structure of arches, the tops of pillars, and generally just most surfaces that could feasibly use a bit of decoration. The last period of Gothic architecture, the late or flamboyant period, began toward the end of the 13th century and continued until the end of the 16th century. Its moniker, flamboyant, should make it clear that the developments of the period were again focused on aesthetic aspects of the buildings. Though there was a shift in the types of buildings being constructed in this style. In 1328, the King of France, Charles IV, also known as Charles the Fair, died without leaving an heir, which, as we all know by now, is a great way to start a war. And start a war it did. The throne went to Charlie's cousin, Philip VI, who ruled for a little while without issue until Charlie's nephew, Edward III, who also happened to be the King of England, reached an age that seemed adequate to start pressing his relatively solid claim on the French throne. In 1337, Philip was kind enough to give Edward a solid basis for a declaration of war when he confiscated the region of Gascony for the French crown, which had been held by England for a couple hundred years. Edward declared himself King of France in 1340, and a war known as the 100 Years' War was on. The importance of this political development in regard to the late Gothic period is that two of the major areas that utilize the Gothic style, England and France, had entered a conflict that would last on and off for over 100 years. Therefore, the general focus as far as construction turned from buildings of cultural relevance, such as cathedrals, to buildings more suited to civil and military use. Town halls, guild halls, and some residences were typical buildings that incorporated flamboyant Gothic features, though a couple notable churches were built in the style, such as the Church of Saint Maclou, completed in 1521, and the Notre Dame de Epina Basilica, completed in 1527. Key features of the flamboyant style include a style of tracery, from which the period gets its name, as the curved tracery looks similar to the elaborate curves of a flame. And the size of windows was further increased with a further reduction in the surface area of walls to create space for windows. There was also a general increase in the amount of molding and tracery on structural features to obscure their less aesthetically pleasing elements, such that nearly every surface in a late Gothic building would have some sort of decorative feature. Gothic architecture changed, improved, and added much to its stylistic predecessor, Romanesque architecture. Looking at examples of the styles, It should be easy to see both the differences and where Gothic architects took inspiration from Romanesque features. The foundations of Romanesque architecture also lay in an arch, the rounded arch, and the barrel and groin vaults formed with rounded arches are the basis of ribbed vaults, which follow the same concept just with pointed arches. The rose window is clearly an expansion on the idea of the oculus, as has been mentioned previously, in the large Gothic pinnacles that adorn many buildings built in the 13th century and beyond are clearly based on the more reserved but still eye-catching Romanesque pinnacles in some of their ornamentation. Some of the more notable differences between Romanesque and Gothic architecture are the structural properties in the windows of the buildings. Though both styles use arches as a foundation for the structure, the difference in the type of arch used led to a variance in structural properties across the board. The key factor in this was the more efficient support that pointed arches provided in comparison to their rounded Romanesque counterparts. The thick walls and pillars, as well as the shorter height of Romanesque churches, could be exchanged for thinner walls, or in most cases, windows, and the pillars that supported the vaults and arcades could be thinner, making for more open floor space. Romanesque structures also had less of a focus on windows, which were a significant element of the Gothic style. They certainly included windows in the designs, and some Romanesque churches had quite a few. But developments in tracery and general structural support helped Gothic architects include more windows in their designs. And there was definitely more of a focus on including them in designs.
Overall, the extra structural support that pointed arches provided allowed Gothic architects to focus more on the decorative side of their work, and this led to a distinct difference in the look and feel of the churches in their time versus structures of the Romanesque period. Generally, Romanesque structures look more utilitarian. The thick pillars and walls, the relatively conservative ornamentation as far as tracery, pinnacles, and molding, as well as the smaller and less decorated windows. This does seem to, in some respect, be a product of the times in which Romanesque structures were built, as the architects would have had simply less resources available to them to work with. Being the predecessor of the Gothic period. By the end of the Gothic period, cathedrals with truly absurd amounts of ornamentation had been built, to the point that one has to wonder how such buildings could possibly have been made at the time. Given the massive scale and intricate decorative work that went into making Gothic structures, it would be fair to wonder how such things were accomplished in the Middle Ages. A style that structurally focused on reaching as high a height as possible clearly presented some significant challenges for the architects of the time.
Beginning with the very large quantities of stone required for the construction, the quarries that provided this stone for cathedrals were typically quite a distance away from the actual construction site. The stone, in most cases limestone, would be cut at the quarry and transported by auction to the site. Cutting the stone at the quarry and then transporting it had the benefit of allowing the outer surface of the limestone to develop a coating of calcination, which helped protect the stone from losing its color or eroding. Height was another major issue in regard to both building the desired height and, once there, ensuring that the structure didn't topple due to the forces involved. The outer walls of the cathedral or church faced a significant amount of outward force from all the arches and vaults on the interior, distributing some of the weight outward. That, coupled with the strength of the wind on a wide, elevated wall, meant that without proper support, the upper walls of the cathedral would quickly collapse. This problem gave rise to the flying buttresses that have been previously discussed, as they provided a sturdy, inward force through the use of outer arches that would stabilize the walls of the clerestory and counter the outward forces within. Keeping the walls of the clerestory was a key issue, and one that would only become more difficult to deal with as Gothic architecture progressed and the less structurally sound windows took up more and more of the walls. To actually reach the tops of the cathedrals to work on these features, wood was used to create all of the scaffolding, hoists, lifts, beams, and platforms needed to work in a relatively safe manner. Wood was implemented in many other aspects of the building as well, so much so that the go-to wood for these sorts of large projects, strong wood such as oak or walnut, would often be cut to the point of shortage in the region, such that other wood, like pine, would have to be used as a substitute in the construction of the scaffolding. Before flying buttresses were developed, the structural integrity of the upper and outer walls was supplemented with iron, which would eventually rust and slowly lose its strength. Iron was exchanged for the buttress in that application, but it still found use as a reinforcement for windows, contributing to the expanding size of the windows along with tracery and other methods. With the amount of materials, effort, and techniques that went into a Gothic cathedral or church, there was, though perhaps not as much as would be expected, a certain degree of planning that went into the construction process. The planning and construction was overseen by master builders and master masons, who, as their name would suggest, were well educated and experienced in the process. They would plan the layout of the building, select the materials to be used, sort out the pay of the laborers, and more. It was often an inherited trade, meaning that a father would teach his son the trade as he grew, and once he came of age, he would have gained all the expansive knowledge of his father's occupation that he needed to supervise construction projects himself. The job of a master builder encompassed many tasks, and for this they were justly compensated. The average master builder received about £50 a year, which converts roughly to $85,000 a year in the modern U.S. dollar. Clearly, they were in demand and well respected, and this was further supported by their guild, the Corporation of Masons. When on the job, they couldn't leave the site for more than 2 months at a time, so their presence was clearly generally essential to the success of the project. Another important thing to remember in regard to master builders and the construction of churches and cathedrals, especially large ones, is that it often took a very, very long time, sometimes meaning up to or over 100 years from the plans being made to a finished cathedral or church. For example, construction on the previously mentioned Notre-Dame de l'Épargne began in 1406 and wasn't completed until 1527. Saint-Maclau's construction lasted from 1435 to 1527. So clearly, another major challenge for master builders was that they would often be planning a cathedral that generations of masons, builders, bishops, and masters would be working on. This is likely why master builder often had to be an inherited trade, as a father would often have to prepare his son to spend the majority of his life working on the same cathedral his father or even grandfather designed. The development of a new cathedral began when the master builder would create a scale model of potential designs, typically made of papier-mâché, plaster, or wood. These models would be presented to the presiding bishops, who would make suggestions for changes until an agreeable design was created. With a general design chosen, the master would then move to large drawings of the cathedral to figure out the measurements and placements of the component parts. The options as far as paper for drawings on that scale were slim at the time, so often the drawings would be done on a crypt floor or other large flat surface in or near the build site. The planning and experience of the master builder certainly helped make the construction a bit easier, but the core goal of Gothic architecture wasn't necessarily conducive to strict planning and conservative designs. Making cathedrals that were as tall as possible, with large windows that certainly didn't help the structural integrity of the upper walls, is quite a challenge, especially given the tools and knowledge available at the time. The leap from small-scale model to massive stone structure was one that often caused problems. Many historians believe that the master builders would simply follow the plan as high as it could go until there was a structural failure, and then simply rebuild up to the point just prior to where the failure had occurred. This trial and error method may sound a bit ridiculous now, but looking at the resources available at the time and the absurd heights that some of the cathedrals were meant to reach, it's hard to blame the master builders for taking that approach. The Gothic style had its beginnings in France, but it soon spread to the majority of Western Europe. England and Germany were rather early adopters of the style, with Gothic buildings appearing in around 1180 and 1230 respectively. It spread a bit later to southern Europe, with regions in Italy, Spain, and Portugal adopting the style in the late 13th century. In Norway, there's an interesting example of a cathedral that begun construction as a Romanesque cathedral in 1070, but partway through its construction took on some Gothic influences, such that when it was completed in 1300, it displayed key elements of both styles, a truly Gothic front coupled with a rather Romanesque back. The impact that Gothic architecture has had cannot be overstated. Buildings that are regarded as some of the most beautiful and famous in the world, such as Westminster Abbey and the Notre-Dame de Paris, are in the Gothic style. The Gothic style experienced a bit of a revival beginning in the 1740s following the Renaissance, with neo-Gothic construction continuing from then on to the modern day. Examples of this revival can be seen in the collegiate Gothic style that is found throughout campuses such as Duke, Yale, and many more.